My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. He's a former federal prosecutor. He is also a contributing editor at National Review, where he's also a columnist, and he's a Fox News contributor. We want to get his insights into the latest few developments into the Mueller investigation into possible Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections. And Andy, it's always good to have you with us. Thank you.
Greg, my pleasure.
Well, there's been a few different headlines here in just the past few days. So we want to get your perspective on how significant they are and why these things may have happened. Let's start with the decision by Bob Mueller and his team to scrap the plea agreement that they had in place with former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. He, of course, had been convicted on a number of things in Virginia, then agreed to the plea deal so he wouldn't have to go on trial again in Washington, D.C., but ultimately they say it's been scrapped because Manafort lied. We don't have a lot more details than that, but as a former prosecutor, just how badly does somebody need to lie to have something like this scrapped?
Well, it really depends on the amount of value that you're bringing to the table. I mean, you'd love to be able to say that we take a principled stand with respect to everything. The fact of the matter is the more important you are to the government, probably the longer leash they'll give you. That's clear from this very case in which it looks like Richard Gates, from what we know about his own testimony, lied pretty extensively after Mueller signed him up, and yet they haven't ripped up his cooperation agreement. It was only Manafort's, and obviously Gates was more useful to them than Manafort has been. But this is, Greg, it's a very interesting situation and a highly unusual one. I was a prosecutor for 20 years, but I never had a situation where a cooperating defendant that I had was a potential candidate for a presidential pardon under circumstances where his incentives in order to position himself for the pardon were against being cooperative with me, or at least ostensibly. So it looks like, Manafort's situation is that, Trump has tweeted out that he greatly respects the fact that Manafort wouldn't make up stories, wouldn't be, had held in and stood strong against the aggressive squeezing by the prosecutor. And I think Manafort, of course, because he's already been convicted, as you mentioned, so even before they sat down to negotiate a plea, Mueller already had 80 years of potential prison exposure in the bank. Manafort has a great incentive to try to or do whatever he can to get a pardon from Trump, because that's really his only way out of this mess. Wow. So does this then damage, given what you said about Rick Gates and now about Manafort, their veracity is clearly in doubt now, as if it wasn't already. And now you've got Michael Cohen, the president's former personal attorney, a couple of different times now pleading guilty to lying about things. So when you're pleading guilty to lying, how effective of a witness can you be later on? You cannot be an effective witness for a prosecutor who's trying to build a criminal case. And if I thought that was what Mueller was trying to do, I'd really be scratching my head. But I'm pretty satisfied that what Mueller is trying to do here is build a collusion case without a crime. The original rationale for Mueller's appointment and for this investigation was that there was a hacking conspiracy. Remember that Putin hacked the election and Trump was somehow complicit in it. That would actually be worthy of a prosecutor's attention, Greg, because hacking is a federal crime, and to have a conspiracy, you need to have an agreement between two or more people to commit a crime. That's why I'm always focused on conspiracy rather than collusion. Collusion's just a weasel word for concerted activity. It can be legal or illegal. We're colluding by having this conversation. It doesn't mean that we're, committing a felony. So I think what happened here is there's no evidence that the Trump campaign was involved in Russia's hacking. No one should ever have thought that the Russians needed help to hack anyone. And the indictments that Mueller has brought seem to preclude the possibility of involvement by any Americans, Trump or anyone else. This is something, the hacking is something the Russians did on their own. So what I think has happened is the collusion narrative has moved its goalposts from a hacking conspiracy to just some kind of nefarious seeming concerted activity with Russia. And whether or not it's criminal to a lot of people who are pushing that narrative is beside the point. So what you have here is Mueller is creating or exposing, depending on the way you look at it, a collusion arrangement between Trump people and the Russians. And despite the fact that he doesn't have a crime that would turn that into a criminal conspiracy, he's camouflaging that with a bunch of false statements, pleas, that he has taken from people who are in Trump's orbit, and also the fact that he has these two indictments against Russians. So what ends up happening, of course, is the press reports that Mueller is investigating collusion between Russia and Trump, and many people have pled guilty in the investigation. And they leave out the inconvenient facts that the Trump people, the guilty pleas of the Trump associates have nothing to do with Russia's interference in the 2016 election, and the indictments of the Russians have nothing to do with the Trump campaign. That's sort of the fine print that gets left out of all this. So that's the way the scheme works.
Yeah, fine print that probably matters quite a bit. So if Bob Mueller doesn't have an underlying crime for this collusion, and I appreciate you explaining the significant difference there, why is he doing all this if there's not actually a crime?
Well, it seems to me that this is a politicization, or a criminalization, I should say, of a criminalization of politics. What Mueller's motivation is here, who knows? I mean, it's not like he's investigating something that's a complete trifle. I mean, even if you don't have a conspiratorial arrangement between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin, some of the stuff that's been revealed through Mueller's investigation, whether it was the Trump Tower meeting where the Trump campaign was happily taking what they hoped was going to be damaging information about Hillary Clinton from the Russian government, and now with this Cohen plea that happened today, we're finding that Mueller has taken the opportunity of this plea to describe a pretty extensive relationship between the Trump companies and high-ranking people in the Russian government, much more extensive than Trump has admitted to in the past, and temporally it went on much longer. Now, it's not a crime to have business with Russia, right? And if you're going to go into business in Russia, Russia's one of those dictatorships where if you're going to do big stuff there, the dictator is in on it, right? So that's just a fact. But I think one of the things that people will probably be alarmed about is the fact that during the campaign and even after the campaign, when Trump was elected, he was adamant that he had no connections, no deals, no nothing with Russia. And now, as we're seeing with the Cohen guilty plea today, the Trump organization had very extensive contacts with the Russian government and with Russians who were close to Putin in negotiations over building this proposed Trump Tower in Moscow. And even though Cohen told a Senate committee that negotiation stopped in January of 2016, when Trump really sort of devoted himself full time to the primaries and to the presidential bid, in point of fact, it went on at least through June or into June of 2016. And I think, Greg, very interestingly, it seems to have gone kaput right at the time that the Trump Tower meeting turned out to be a bust. The Trump Tower meeting happened on June the 14th of 2016. And just so listeners know what we're talking about here quickly, that was the meeting at which Don Trump Jr. and a Russian who has ties to Putin arranged a meeting where a Kremlin-tied lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya was supposed to bring information that would be damaging to Hillary Clinton that they could use in the campaign. And the meeting turned out to be a bust. It turned out that she didn't have anything useful. And I think it's very interesting that right after that meeting was a bust, 5 days later, Cohen pulls the plug on or Cohen tells the Russians that the plug has been pulled on the Trump Tower business in Moscow.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. As we exit here, a couple of quick questions for you, Andy. Given the big picture of what we're seeing with the Mueller investigation, you mentioned it's different in some ways because you usually don't have defendants who are almost banking on a presidential pardon. But if prosecutors are investigating and they get closer and closer to determining there's not an underlying crime, is it typical in any way for them to have this many indictments on making false statements?
No, usually, in a normal, this, Greg, really goes to the perversity of the institution of special counsel, which over the years has been called special prosecutor, independent counsel. It's been an institution that's existed under various laws and regulations over time. Now it exists under Justice Department regulations that are in the Code of Federal Regulations. But in whatever iteration of it that you find, the problem with it, one of the big problems with it, is in a normal prosecutor's office, you don't have time or resources to investigate something that's not a crime. So, if something comes in that's suspicious, you investigate it, and when you find that there's nothing there that you can charge, you close the file and you move on to the next case because there's too much other work to do to spend that kind of time on a kind of a dry hole. On the other hand, the special counsel institution is really a matter of signing a prosecutor to one set of targets or even sometimes to a single target. Now, usually in those arrangements, at least we know what's under investigation. So, for example, Nixon knew that, Watergate was the transaction. We've had Iran-Contra. We've had the Lewinsky matter. But always the president knew exactly what was being investigated and what crimes were being alleged. Here, this is, I think, the worst case I've ever seen of it because what they assigned to Mueller was a counterintelligence investigation, which is not a criminal investigation. It's just an information gathering exercise. So really on the pretext of the so-called Russia investigation, that is to get to the bottom of what did Russia do to interfere with our election, under the auspices of that, Mueller has really been allowed to essentially, cast his line wherever he chooses to and fish around for a crime until he finds one. And that's really not the arrangement we usually have in this country. I mean, in this country, usually you have a crime first that everybody either knows about or strongly suspects, and then you assign a prosecutor. That's not what happened here.
And Andy, we've talked about this last question before, but it seems to be relevant again this week, given the amount of tweeting the president has done for a guy who's probably not dealing with an investigation that's found an underlying crime. The way he goes after Mueller on Twitter could not be much worse, it seems, for his PR standpoint.
Yeah, well, when you see things like today happen, Greg, two things occur. One is, sometimes people look at that stuff and they think, well, that's just Trump's way. It's bluster. And then there are other people who say it's the way you act when, you realize you're in the crosshairs and maybe you have some vulnerability and he's lashing out. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other thing is, I just mentioned a couple minutes ago the president having said that he had no dealings in Russia, he had no connections with them, no loans, no deals, no arrangements. And that looks very bad now when you compare it to some of the information that's coming out today. And I'm sure the president's lawyers have advised him of this, but he's not doing himself any favors by shooting from the hip the way he seems to do on Twitter. I know that it works politically, but I can assure you, as somebody who was a prosecutor for a very long time, it's not a smart thing to do legally if you have prosecutors who are and investigators who are looking into your affairs.
Wow. Well, Andy, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time today. Thanks for helping us understand all these latest developments on a very real level, given your experience as a prosecutor. And as always, we appreciate it very much. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Greg.
Andy McCarthy, former federal prosecutor, contributing editor at National Review, as well as a Fox News contributor. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.